He thought it was just another courtroom, until the woman he humiliated became the one person he couldn't control. The air inside the Chicago courthouse felt heavier than usual that morning, like something unseen was pressing down on every shoulder, every breath, every word waiting to be spoken. Fluorescent lights cast a cold, sterile glow over polished wooden benches, and the quiet murmur of voices echoed softly against the high ceilings. But beneath that calm, there was tension, something unspoken, something ready to snap. Officer Daniel Brooks stood near the front, his uniform crisp, his posture confident, the kind of confidence that came from years of never being questioned, never being challenged. His eyes scanned the room with quiet authority, lingering just a second longer on anyone who looked out of place. And then she walked in. Maya Carter, no escort, no announcement, just a steady presence moving down the aisle. Her steps measured, her expression unreadable. Dressed in a simple dark blazer and slacks, she didn't draw attention, yet somehow the room shifted when she passed, like people could feel something they couldn't explain. Brooks noticed immediately, his gaze narrowing, as if trying to place her, trying to understand why she didn't lower her eyes like the others, didn't shrink under the weight of his stare. Imagine standing there in a room where judgment comes before truth, where one look decides who belongs and who doesn't. Maya took her seat calmly, placing a small folder on the table in front of her, her hands still, her breathing. Even she didn't look at Brooks, not once, and somehow that bothered him more than anything. The whispers started quietly at first, a few glances exchanged, a subtle tension building like a storm forming just beyond the horizon. Brooks stepped forward, his voice cutting through the room, sharp, controlled, carrying that familiar edge of authority, questioning her presence, her purpose. His tone dipped just enough to draw attention, just enough to make others listen, and the room responded the way it always did, with silence, with compliance, with that quiet agreement. That power didn't need to explain itself. But Maya didn't respond, not immediately. She simply lifted her eyes and met his gaze, steady, unshaken, and in that moment something flickered across his face, not doubt, not yet, but irritation, the kind that comes when control begins to slip, even if only by an inch. Seconds stretched longer than they should. The judge hadn't entered yet, no proceedings had begun, but already the tension felt like it had reached its peak, like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Brooks took another step closer, his presence looming, his voice lower, now more personal, more pointed, and still she didn't move, didn't react, didn't give him what he expected. And that silence, that stillness became louder than anything else in the room, because sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't resistance, it's restraint. And Brooks had no idea who he was standing in front of or what line he was about to cross. The silence did not break, it stretched thin like glass ready to crack, and Officer Brooks felt it pressing against him harder with every second. She refused to respond. He was used to quick reactions, lowered eyes, defensive words, something he could push against, but Maya Carter gave him nothing, and that nothing unsettled him more than open defiance. His jaw tightened as he glanced around the room, noticing the subtle shifts, the way a few people leaned forward, the way others avoided eye contact, as if they sensed something changing, even if they could not name it. The judge still had not entered the courtroom. Clerks shuffled papers nervously, and the low hum of whispered conversation began to build again, like distant thunder. Brooks exhaled, slowly stepping even closer, his voice dropping into something quieter, sharper, the kind of tone meant to isolate, meant to make a single person feel small in a crowded room. "You are in the wrong place," he said, each word measured, deliberate. But Maya remained still, her fingers resting lightly on the folder in front of her, as if it held no weight at all, as if nothing in that moment could rush her. Imagine standing there knowing exactly who you are while the entire room assumes you are something less. Her eyes lifted again, meeting his, and this time there was something different, not anger, not fear, but clarity, the kind that comes from certainty. Brooks hesitated just for a fraction of a second, and it was enough for the shift to deepen. A court officer near the back straightened his posture, watching more closely now. A woman seated in the second row stopped, whispering mid-sentence. The air changed, not louder, not chaotic, just sharper, like every detail had come into focus at once. Brooks cleared his throat, attempting to regain control, but control is fragile when it depends on perception, and perception was beginning to slip. He gestured toward the empty space beside her, as if directing her to move, as if asserting order, but Maya did not follow. She did not challenge him either. She simply stayed exactly where she was, grounded, unmovable, and that stillness began to draw attention in a way no argument ever could. Seconds passed longer than they should have, until finally she spoke, her voice calm, steady, carrying across the room Without force, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. The words were simple, but they landed with weight not because of how they were said, but because of how certain they sounded. Brooks let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but it did not carry confidence anymore. It carried something thinner, something closer to irritation mixed with doubt. He turned slightly, scanning the room again as if looking for support, but the room no longer moved with him. It watched, and in that watching something shifted beneath the surface, something quiet, but undeniable, because sometimes power does not disappear all at once, sometimes it fades one moment at a time, and Brooks was beginning to feel it, even if he refused to understand why the room did not return to normal after she spoke. It could not, because something invisible had already shifted, and everyone could feel it even if they did not fully understand it. Officer Brooks straightened his posture again, trying to rebuild the authority that had always come so easily to him. But this time it felt different, like standing on ground that no longer held steady beneath his feet. He looked at her again, more carefully now, as if seeing her for the first time, not just a woman sitting alone, but something he could not immediately define, something that did not fit into the assumptions he had already made. Imagine realizing too late that the story you thought you were in is not the one that is actually unfolding. The courtroom doors opened quietly, and the judge entered, robes flowing with quiet authority. The room stood in unison, the sound of chairs sliding back echoing softly across the floor. But even that familiar ritual felt slightly off, like the timing had changed by just a second too long. The judge took his seat, glancing briefly across the room, his expression neutral, but his eyes paused when they landed on Maya. There was recognition there, subtle, but real, gone as quickly as it appeared, but not unnoticed. Brooks caught it, and something tightened in his chest, a small crack forming in the certainty he had been holding onto. The proceedings began. Routine words, procedural language, the kind that usually smoothed everything into order, but today every word seemed to land differently, heavier, like each sentence carried more weight than it should. Brooks shifted slightly, his attention no longer fully on the case being called, but on the woman seated just a few feet away from him. Maya opened her folders slowly, the movement calm, deliberate. Inside were documents neatly organized, nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention at first glance. But her focus as she reviewed them was precise, almost clinical, like someone verifying details rather than searching for answers. A court clerk approached her briefly, handing over an additional sheet of paper, and in that brief exchange the clerk nodded, not out of politeness, but something closer to respect. Brooks noticed that too, and the pieces did not fit, not with the version of her he had already decided on. The quiet murmurs in the gallery returned, but softer, now more cautious, like people were beginning to sense that they had misunderstood something important. Maya turned a page, then another, her expression unchanged, but her presence now filled the space differently, not louder, not aggressive, but undeniable, the kind of presence that does not demand attention, yet commands it anyway. Brooks leaned slightly toward another officer nearby, whispering a question under his breath, but the response he received was uncertain, a small shake of the head, nothing confirmed, nothing explained, and that uncertainty spread faster than any accusation ever could, because doubt, once introduced, does not stay contained. It grows, it connects, it reshapes everything around it. The judge called for order again, his voice firm, bringing the room back to focus. But even as attention returned to the front, something remained unresolved beneath the surface, like a question no one had asked out loud. Yet Maya closed her folder gently, placing her hands on top of it, her gaze lifting once more toward the front of the courtroom, but not before passing briefly over Brooks. And in that brief moment, there was no challenge, no anger, only certainty, the kind that does not need to prove itself. And that was the moment Brooks realized something was wrong, not with the room, not with the case, but with his understanding of who she was, because the more he tried to place her, the less sense anything made, and somewhere deep beneath that realization was a feeling he had not expected to experience. That day, the quiet, unmistakable beginning of losing control. The rhythm of the courtroom settled into something that looked like order, but felt like tension stretched too tight. Every word spoken from the bench echoed with a strange weight, as if even the smallest detail mattered more than it should. Officer Brooks remained standing near his position, but his focus had shifted completely, no longer on the proceedings, no longer on the routine flow of law, but on Maya Carter, because nothing about her fit anymore. Not her composure, not the way the clerk had acknowledged her, not even the way the judge had paused for that brief, almost imperceptible second. Imagine sensing that you have already made a mistake, but not yet knowing how deep it runs. Brooks adjusted his stance again, his fingers brushing lightly against his belt, a habitual motion, one that usually grounded him, but this time it did nothing. The certainty he relied on was fading, replaced by something far less comfortable, awareness. Maya, on the other hand, did not move much at all. She listened, her attention sharp, tracking every word, every exchange, as if she were not just present, but evaluating, measuring something beneath the surface. Her eyes shifted occasionally, not randomly, but with purpose, noting faces, noting reactions, noting patterns that others would never notice, because they were not trained to look for them. A man seated 2 rows back straightened when her gaze passed over him, a subtle reaction, but real, and it did not go unnoticed by Brooks, who was now watching everything more closely than before, trying to catch up to something that had already started unfolding. Without him, the prosecutor spoke next, outlining details in a steady, controlled voice, but there was a slight hesitation halfway through, a glance toward the bench, then toward Maya, as if seeking silent confirmation before continuing, and that hesitation spread quietly through the room like a ripple. No one acknowledged it, but everyone felt it. Brooks felt it most of all, because it directly challenged the invisible structure. He had always trusted the idea that roles were fixed, that authority was clear, that control belonged to those who claimed it. But now those lines were blurring, and Maya had not raised her voice, had not made a demand, had not done anything that could be called disruptive. Yet everything was shifting around her, as if her presence alone was enough to alter the balance of the room. She reached for her folder again, opening it with the same calm precision, and this time she removed a single document, placing it on the table in front of her, not presenting it, not announcing it, just setting it there like a piece already in position, waiting for the right moment. Brooks leaned slightly, trying to catch a glimpse, but the angle was wrong, the details hidden, and that lack of access only deepened the unease building inside him, because control often depends on visibility, and right now, he could not see what mattered. A court officer near the door adjusted his stance, speaking quietly into a small radio clipped near his shoulder, the movement subtle but deliberate, and it added another layer to the growing tension, like something larger was coordinating just beyond what the room could fully perceive. The judge called for a brief pause, reviewing notes in front of him, but his expression had changed, no longer purely procedural. There was focus now, a level of attention that suggested he understood more than he was saying. Maya closed her folder, once more her hands resting calmly as before, but the energy around her had shifted from quiet presence to quiet command. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable, and Brooks felt it fully now, the realization settling in piece by piece that whatever this moment was becoming, he was no longer in control of it, and the next move would not be his. To make the pause called by the judge did not feel like a break, it felt like a shift, like the moment just before something hidden finally steps into the light. The quiet in the courtroom deepened, not empty, but charged, as if every person present sensed that whatever came next would not follow the usual script. Officer Brooks remained still, but his stillness no longer came from confidence, it came from calculation, his mind working quickly, trying to connect fragments that refused to align. The clerk, the glance from the judge, the document on the table, the subtle movements near the door, none of it made sense within the structure. He understood, and that uncertainty pressed against him harder with each passing second. Imagine realizing that the rules you relied on were never the real rules to begin with. Maya Carter sat exactly as she had before, composed, steady, but now there was a shift in how the room responded to her, not openly, not dramatically, but in the way attention gravitated toward her, without being called, in the way silence seemed to organize itself around her presence. The judge leaned forward, slightly reviewing the notes before him once more, then lifting his eyes toward Maya, not with curiosity this time, but with acknowledgement, the kind given when roles are understood without needing to be spoken. The prosecutor hesitated again, glancing between the bench and Maya, before stepping back a fraction of an inch, as if instinctively yielding space. Brooks noticed that movement, and something in his chest tightened further, because space in a courtroom is never accidental, it is given or taken, and right now, it was being given to someone he had already dismissed. Maya reached for the document she had placed on the table earlier, her fingers moving with deliberate calm as she lifted it, not raising it high, not presenting it, yet just holding it, as if weighing the exact moment it would matter most. Her eyes moved briefly across the room, pausing for a fraction of a second on the court officer near the door, and in that silent exchange there was coordination, not visible, not spoken, but undeniable. The officer straightened slightly, his hand brushing near his radio again, but this time he did not speak. He simply waited. Brooks shifted his stance once more. The subtle unease now impossible to ignore because everything around him was beginning to operate on a level he could not access. The judge cleared his throat, the sound cutting cleanly through the silence. And when he spoke, his voice carried a different tone, not louder, not harsher, but precise, the kind of tone reserved for moments that redefine everything that comes after. Miss Carter, the judge said, and the name landed in the room with weight, drawing every eye toward her at once. Brooks felt it immediately, the shift from assumption to recognition, from uncertainty to focus, and in that instant something inside him dropped, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to change how he stood, how he breathed, how he understood. The moment Maya rose to her feet, smoothly, the motion controlled, unhurried, and as she stood the entire room seemed to adjust with her, not because she demanded it, but because it was inevitable. She placed the document gently on the table in front of her, now fully visible, though still unreadable from where Brooks stood, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried no strain, no hesitation, only clarity. Your Honor, I believe it is time. The record reflects the full context of this proceeding. The words were simple, but they did something the room could not undo. They shifted the center of gravity completely, and for the first time since she had entered, Maya was no longer just present. She was leading, and Brooks understood, then not fully, not yet, but enough to feel it, that whatever was about to be revealed had already been in motion long before he ever stepped into that courtroom, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The words did not echo loudly, yet they settled over the courtroom with undeniable force, as if every surface absorbed their meaning. At once Maya Carter remained standing, her posture straight, her presence no longer quiet but defined, and the document before her now felt less like paper and more like a turning point. The judge gave a slight nod, not rushed, not hesitant, but deliberate, granting space for what was about to unfold, and in that moment the structure of the room shifted completely from routine to revelation. Imagine realizing that what you thought was a simple case was never simple at all, that every second leading up to this had been part of something larger, something already decided long before you understood it. Officer Brooks felt the change fully, now not as a distant awareness, but as something immediate pressing against him, his mind searching for control, for something familiar to hold on to, but nothing in front of him followed the patterns he knew. The prosecutor stepped back further, clearing the space without being asked. The clerk stopped writing, her pen hovering just above the page, as if even documentation needed to wait. Maya reached for the document again, this time turning it so it faced the bench, her movement precise, measured, as if every inch of motion had been considered before it ever happened. Your Honor, she continued, her voice steady, carrying across the room, without strain. This proceeding intersects with an active federal review, and the information presented so far does not reflect the full scope of that review. The words were calm, but they carried weight, the kind that does not need volume to be understood. A faint shift moved through the gallery, the kind of reaction people try to suppress, but cannot entirely hide. Brooks felt it immediately, the change from passive observation to active attention, every eye no longer drifting, but fixed, every breath held a fraction longer. The judge leaned forward slightly, his expression tightening, not in resistance, but in focus, a recognition that the moment had crossed into something far more serious than originally presented. Miss Carter, he said, his voice controlled, yet unmistakably attentive, please clarify for the record. And with that invitation, the final barrier disappeared. Maya did not rush, she did not emphasize, she simply stepped into the moment fully. Sergeant Maya Carter, United States Military Police, assigned to interagency review operations, she said, each word clear, each title placed exactly where it needed to be, and as those words settled into the room, the effect was immediate, not explosive, but absolute, the kind of shift that cannot be undone. Brooks felt it before he could process it fully. The title alone carried implications far beyond what he had assumed, far beyond what he had prepared for. His posture changed slightly, not by choice, but by instinct, the same instinct that recognizes authority when it is real, not claimed, not performed, but inherent. Maya continued, her gaze steady, now meeting the judge directly. This courtroom has been included in a broader investigation regarding procedural conduct and jurisdictional overreach. All interactions recorded today are subject to that review. The statement landed with precision, not accusatory, not emotional, but definitive, and in that clarity the structure Brooks had relied on collapsed completely, not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally, where it mattered most, because control once lost in understanding cannot be reclaimed through posture alone. The court officer near the door stepped forward, now not abruptly, but with purpose, his presence no longer passive, and Brooks saw it clearly for the first time, not as coincidence, not as routine, but as alignment pieces that had been in place long before he recognized them. Maya lowered her hand, slightly resting it near the document, her expression unchanged, but her presence now unmistakable. She was not reacting to the moment, she was guiding it, and Brooks understood then with a clarity that left no room for denial that he had not been confronting a disruption. He had been stepping into a structure already built, already watching, already waiting, and now finally revealing itself. The words settled into the room like a verdict already decided, and no one spoke for a moment, not because they were confused, but because they understood exactly what had just happened. The balance of power had shifted completely, and there was no returning to what it had been before. Sergeant Maya Carter did not raise her voice, did not step forward, did not demand attention, because she no longer needed to. The authority in the room had already moved to her side. Imagine standing in a place where you believed you held control, only to realize that every action you took had been seen, recorded, and measured long before you even understood the situation. Officer Brooks felt it in the way the air changed around him, in the way people no longer looked to him for cues, no longer waited for his reaction. His presence, which once shaped the room, now seemed disconnected from it, like he was standing just outside of something he could no longer influence. The judge adjusted his posture slightly, his attention now fully aligned with Maya, his tone careful, precise. "Sergeant Carter, please proceed." And with that simple acknowledgement, the structure became official. What had been implied was now recognized. Maya inclined her head slightly, a gesture of respect, not submission. Then she reached for another page within her folder, her movements steady, unhurried, as if time itself had slowed to match her pace. This review, she continued, encompasses a pattern of conduct not limited to a single incident, but extending across multiple interactions within this jurisdiction. Her words were not dramatic, yet they carried the kind of clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. A quiet stir moved through the gallery, not loud, not chaotic, but enough to signal that understanding was spreading. Brooks remained still, but his thoughts raced, searching for something to anchor to, something that could restore the certainty he had lost. But the more he searched, the more it became clear there was nothing left to hold on to, because this moment was not reacting to him. It had moved beyond him completely. The court officer who had been near the door stepped further into view, now his posture formal, his attention directed not at the room, but at Maya, awaiting instruction rather than offering it. And that single shift said more than any spoken word could. Brooks noticed it, and in that instant the final piece fell into place, the realization that this had never been about asserting control, it had been about revealing the absence of it. Maya placed the second document beside the first, aligning them carefully before continuing. All recorded interactions within this courtroom today will be submitted as part of the official review process, including procedural conduct and direct engagement. She paused just long enough for the weight of that statement to settle, then added with the same calm certainty, "This includes all actions taken prior to and during the session." The room absorbed those words in silence, because everyone understood what they meant, not just in theory, but in consequence. Brooks felt the shift internally, now deeper than before, not just uncertainty, but recognition, the kind that arrives when denial is no longer possible. His posture changed again, subtly, not outwardly dramatic, but enough to reflect what he now knew, that whatever authority he believed he held had already been examined and found lacking. Maya lifted her gaze once more, her eyes steady, as they moved briefly across the room, not searching, not questioning, simply acknowledging what was already clear. Then she returned her attention to the bench, her voice unchanged, her presence unwavering. "The record is now complete, Your Honor." And with that statement, the moment closed, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with something far more powerful, certainty, because the truth had not been forced into the room. It had been waiting there all along, and now finally it had been seen. The silence that followed did not feel like an ending, it felt like the moment after a truth has been spoken, and no one can pretend they did not hear it. The courtroom remained still, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer tension waiting to break, it was clarity settling into place. Sergeant Maya Carter remained standing for a brief second longer, then calmly took her seat again, her movements unhurried, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, even though everything had changed. Imagine watching a moment unfold where no one raises their voice, yet everything shifts in a way that cannot be reversed. The judge looked down at the documents in front of him, then back up at Maya. His expression measured, but no longer neutral. There was recognition there. And something else, responsibility, the kind that comes when authority is no longer assumed, but required. He adjusted his glasses slightly, then spoke, his voice steady, carrying through the room. With renewed precision, the court acknowledges the information presented and will proceed in accordance with applicable federal review protocols. The words were formal, but their meaning was clear. The courtroom was no longer operating under its original control. Brooks felt the weight of that statement settle over him, not as pressure, but as finality. The structure he had relied on was gone, replaced by something he could not influence, something already moving forward without him. The court officer stepped closer, now his presence no longer background, his posture aligned with a different chain of command, his attention no longer directed toward maintaining order in the room, but toward ensuring the process unfolding was protected. Brooks noticed the shift fully. Now the way people no longer looked to him, the way the subtle hierarchy had reorganized itself, without a single command being given. Maya reached forward once more, organizing the documents neatly, as if closing a chapter, her focus precise, her expression unchanged, yet there was a quiet finality in her movements, like someone completing a task that had been set long before. This moment the prosecutor remained silent, no longer leading, no longer questioning, simply observing as the direction of the case moved beyond their control. The gallery sat in complete stillness, no whispers, no movement, just attention, because everyone understood that what they had witnessed was not a disruption, but a revelation. Brooks stood where he was, but something about his presence had shifted, not physically, but in how it was perceived. He was no longer the center of authority, no longer the figure shaping the room. He was part of the record, now part of what had been observed, evaluated, and preserved, and that realization settled into him slowly, but completely. Maya lifted her eyes once more, her gaze steady, not directed at Brooks, not seeking reaction, but simply acknowledging the space as it now existed. The room had not become louder, it had not become chaotic, it had become precise, every role redefined, every assumption corrected, and in that precision there was no room left for misunderstanding. The judge called for a brief recess, his voice firm, bringing formal closure to the moment. But even as the gavel touched the bench, the sound did not signal an end, it marked a transition, because what had begun here was not confined to this room, it extended beyond it into a system that had already been set in motion and would continue long after the courtroom emptied. And as people slowly began to rise from their seats, one truth remained clear. Not everything that looks like power truly is, and sometimes the moment it is tested is the moment it disappears completely. The courtroom slowly began to empty, but the weight of what had happened did not leave with the people. It stayed in the air, in the walls, in the quiet glances exchanged as strangers passed each other. Without speaking, Sergeant Maya Carter gathered her documents with the same calm precision she had shown from the beginning. No rush, no hesitation, just completion, like someone closing a file that had already been decided long before this day. Officer Brooks remained where he was for a moment longer, watching as the room moved on. Without him, the noise returning gradually, footsteps, soft conversations, the distant sound of a door closing, but none of it felt the same. Imagine standing in a place where just minutes ago you believed you controlled everything, and now realizing the moment has passed, and it did not belong to you at all. Brooks exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering. Not in defeat, but in recognition, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to argue, nothing left to assert, because the truth has already taken its place. Without permission, without resistance, he looked toward the bench, now empty, the authority that once defined the space now reduced to a symbol of process rather than power. And then his gaze shifted to Maya. She had not looked back at him, not once, not after the reveal, not after the shift, not after the silence, because she did not need to. Acknowledgement was no longer required. The record had already been made, the outcome already set in motion. Maya stepped into the aisle, her path clear, her presence still commanding in a way that did not demand attention, yet drew it effortlessly. A court officer fell into step beside her, not leading, not guiding, simply accompanying, as if the direction had already been understood. Brooks watched that detail closely, because it confirmed what he now fully realized. Authority is not always visible until the moment it chooses to be, and by then it is already too late to challenge it. The gallery doors opened, and light from the hallway spilled into the room, softer, warmer, contrasting the cold stillness that had defined the courtroom moments before. Maya paused briefly at the threshold, not turning back, not hesitating, just allowing a single second to pass before continuing forward, and in that second, there was something unspoken, something final, not directed at anyone in particular, but present for anyone who understood the weight of what had just occurred. Brooks took a step forward, then stopped, not because he was held back, but because there was nowhere left to go. The structure he had relied on had already moved beyond him, and chasing it now would not restore what had been lost. It would only confirm it. He lowered his gaze briefly, then looked up again. The room, now nearly empty, the echo of footsteps fading into silence. And in that silence, there was clarity, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, because the moment had not been about confrontation. It had been about revelation, about showing what had always been there beneath assumption, beneath routine, beneath unchecked authority. Maya disappeared into the hallway, her figure steady, her pace unchanged, and with her went the center of gravity that had reshaped everything. Brooks remained behind, not as a figure of control, but as part of a story already written, already recorded, already understood. And as the final door closed and the last sound faded, one truth remained clear: the law does not belong to the one who speaks the loudest. It belongs to the one who stands in it without needing to prove anything at all.